In the middle of the night, a man watched in horror as his neighbor committed a horrible crime. The perpetrator said he had no recollection of the incident. It would be up to a jury to decide between the forensic evidence or the mysteries of the mind. On a brisk January night in Phoenix, Arizona, a man heard some noises coming from his neighbor's backyard.
He actually heard some moaning sounds coming from over the fence. He thought that perhaps the Filators were making love because that's what the sounds sounded like to him.
He saw Yarmela Filator on the ground, and her husband Scott was in the house upstairs changing his clothes. Scott came back downstairs, silenced the dog, walked outside to Yarmela, then threw her into the swimming pool and held her head underwater. The neighbor immediately called police.
Looked up and down, and the husband just threw, I believe, the wife into the pool and looked like he pulled her underwater.
The police found Yarmela floating in the pool. She had been stabbed and drowned. Scott was inside the house, dazed and confused.
His reaction was kind of a surprise what the officers were doing at this location.
The first question he remembers is, how many people are in the house? To which he answered 4, immediately, not knowing his wife was dead. Himself, his wife, and his 2 kids.
The Filators' 2 children were asleep upstairs in their bedrooms. They heard nothing during the attack. At police headquarters, investigators were convinced that Scott would confess, but they were met with a complete surprise.
I'll take a couple minutes. You okay? Cold?
Obviously you think I did it. I don't know what makes you think that.
Well, because I had a neighbor staring at you watching you do it, that's why.
Jeez.
Scott Filator said he had no recollection of killing his wife.
Neighbors saw me pushing her in the pool. You've got to be kidding.
That's Linda?
I'm sorry, I don't remember doing it.
Friends and family told police that the Filators never fought.
There had never been any eruption of overt conflict between the mother and father, and that whenever there were disagreements, they were settled amicably.
At Yarmela's autopsy, the medical examiner found 44 stab wounds, as well as water in her lungs.
We had the wife, who had been stabbed multiple times, being thrown in the pool and held down. But we also had a husband, a very devout religious individual, telling us that it was not him who had done this. So the decision had to be made. Were we going to believe him, or were we going to go ahead and charge him?
In the back of Scott's car, in a plastic container, police found a knife covered with blood.
Been attacked by Scott when he was sleepwalking years ago. They were growing up in Illinois. She had attempted to interrupt Scott as he was walking in the house, sleepwalking, and that, startled by her interruption, he threw her across the room.
Sleep expert Dr. Rosalind Cartwright says that there's no doubt that sleepwalking occurs, although it's rare.
Some sleepwalkers, for example, have jumped out of a window or thrust their arm through a plate glass door, carved up the nice new living room furniture with a butcher knife, kicked in a garage door. These are all patients of mine. And some attack a person. The closest person to them is likely to be attacked.
So the question remained, was Scott Filator sleepwalking when he murdered his wife? To find out, Scott was monitored for 4 nights in a sleep laboratory,
so that they could determine the types of brain waves that were characteristic of his sleeping patterns.
Researchers connected electrodes from a polysomnograph to Filator's skull to analyze his brain activity during sleep. The results showed lose their jobs. After dinner, Scott said he worked at his computer, then went to bed. He said Yarmela was downstairs watching TV on the sofa. Dr. Cartwright believes Scott went to sleep with the unfinished pool repair still on his mind. And while still asleep, got up to finish the job. He put on his clothes, grabbed a flashlight, and took a knife out to the pool pump to cut a plastic ring. When Yarmila went outside to see what Scott was doing, she startled him, prompting the violent attack that followed.
They start out to do something related to that stressful event. And if stopped, they have a kind of fight or flight reaction of, I've got to do this.
Research shows that sleepwalkers are not capable of facial recognition, which is why they sometimes attack people they know.
It's embarrassing. You don't even know where you're walking or what you're doing.
Doug Coltrane has had numerous sleepwalking incidents, some that have included violence towards his wife.
I was on top of her, choking her. I wasn't aware that I was even doing that. I could tell that there's something that was drastically wrong once I woke up, but I was in a deep sleep while I was doing it. I wasn't really aware that I even did it.
People who sleep normally move from one stage of sleep to the next, seamlessly without waking. But for reasons not entirely clear, sleepwalkers cannot successfully transition from deep sleep into the dreaming stage of sleep.
They get into a dissociated state. It's not a normal wakefulness. It's not a complete sleep. It's partially one and partially the other. Part of the brain is functioning as if awake. Part of the brain is not.
If Scott Filleder was sleepwalking when he committed the crime, then legally he wouldn't be responsible. That's what happened in Toronto, Canada, when 23-year-old Ken Parks was acquitted of killing his mother-in-law and attacking his father-in-law.
Even though he drove approximately 15 miles over to his mother-in-law's house and had walked down some stairs, opened the door, and then ultimately had stabbed both of the individuals there.
Well, I do agree that sleepwalkers are capable of becoming violent. Probably over 100 published cases by people who were apparently sleepwalking.
But prosecutors weren't so convinced that Scott Filleder was innocent. As investigators would have to weigh the evidence and decide whom to believe.
I think that was part of the fascination of this case was that it was attempting to probe the secrets of the mind. You know, the last frontier of medical science, perhaps it's the brain. It was also seeking to probe the secrets of a family.
In 1999, Scott Filleder went on trial for the murder of his wife, Yarmila. He pleaded not guilty.
He was sleepwalking at the time the event occurred, and he had no consciousness in his mind operating at that time. In fact, his brain was in fact asleep.
Sleepwalking has been used as a defense in about 24 murder trials worldwide.
She went down, and he continued to stab her.
But prosecutors presented a very powerful case to the jury, one that focused on logic as well as science. Prosecutors believe Filleder made the decision to kill his wife and to make it appear to be the work of an unknown assailant. When the children went to bed, Yarmila was on the sofa watching television. Prosecutors think Filleder lured Yarmila out to the pool, then stabbed her. He went back upstairs to clean up, and he also bandaged his hand. He hid the murder weapon and his bloody clothes in the trunk of his car. When he returned to the pool, Scott quieted the dog and noticed Yarmila was still breathing, so he dragged her over to the pool and drowned her. Prosecutors think his original plan was to go back to bed and the next morning let the children find their mother's body outside.
One can only imagine that he pretends to awake, finds that his wife is gone, wakes up the children, is aghast that she is gone, goes downstairs, and the three of them find her floating in the pool, slain by an unknown intruder. That was his plan all along.
But those plans changed when his neighbor saw the whole thing.
That was the only thing that Scott Filleder did not predict.
Prosecutors think Scott may have known about the Toronto case, the man who was acquitted of killing his mother-in-law using a sleepwalking defense. Dr. Pressman testified for the prosecution and listed 65 behaviors Scott exhibited during the commission of the crime that were inconsistent with sleepwalking. He said touching the cold water alone would have been enough to wake him from a sleepwalking episode.
I think all the evidence says he was awake, and all the evidence says his behaviors were far too complicated to be sleepwalking.
In testifying for the defense, Dr. Roger Broughton said Scott's actions that night were not logical for someone who was awake.
It's my opinion that he was sleepwalking. He would not leave all of the evidence there, would not leave bloody clothes in the back of a car that he was going to drive, would not leave a pool full of blood. To me, none of these make sense.
Scott Fillate took the stand and testified in his own defense.
I assume that I must have gone crazy, or that something in my head had broken.
The jury didn't buy it.
Okay, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, upon our oaths do find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree.
Scott Fillate was sentenced to life in prison.
The number of stab wounds, the fact that she was dragged to the pool and held under, I can't believe she...
But just like in every other science, it is prone to being misused. And in this case, that's what was happening. Scott Fillate wanted to misuse it.